Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bat Cave. As always, please make sure you are subscribing to Larry's Bat Cave. Tonight, we're actually going to be talking about something rather interesting. In reflecting back to my experience from a couple of weeks ago and going to Free Comic Book Day, I first of all was able to acquire some great comic books that I had been looking for a while. I actually was able to acquire the entire Death in the Family Batman story, which we're actually going to be talking about in depth tonight for a little bit, just to analyze the main focus. When I went to the comic book store and I picked up the copy of Death in the Family, I noticed something very interesting. First of all, this comic is from the late 80s. On the front page, in a white box, it said something I thought was very interesting. It said, end quote, comic books aren't just for kids. Now, I know there are people throughout the last 50 or 60 years that have always said that comic books are considered what's called funny books or junk, just for children, they're for babies, so on and so forth. But it's my belief that comic books have always been a type of medium that is able to cater to people of all ages, children, teenagers, young adults. In today's day and age, it's very common to go into a comic book store and find people of an older generation looking through the comic book racks and seeing what missing issues they're looking for. But I want to look and analyze tonight about the stigma that comic books are just for children. Rather, I want to support the claim that comic books are more than just for children, they're for everybody. To help us understand this, we really need to look in depth at the comic book industry, the history of the comic book industry as a whole. So, for those of you who are not aware, the comic book industry, in terms of individual comic books, came to exist in the late 1930s, specifically with the debut of Action Comics #1, with the debut of Superman, and Detective Comics #27 with the debut of Batman. Pretty much the modern comic came into existence at that point. And throughout the late 30s and early 40s, comic books really were in their what's referred to as golden age, the golden era of their existence, because people would go, primarily children at the time, I will say that, would go into comic book stores, not stores, but your local convenience store, and they would buy from the rack, maybe 3, 5, maybe 10-cent comic books. And if you have one of those comics from that time now that's pristine, it's probably worth a lot of money. But when we get to the 1950s, the comic book industry is pretty much rocked to its core. In the mid 1950s, there was a psychiatrist named Dr. Frederick Wertham who targeted the comic book industry as being the cause of why children turn into delinquents. And his findings were very interesting. He said that children that read comics would develop severe health concerns such as asthma, and weren't getting enough fresh air, and were leading to more incidents of delinquency. And all his findings were published in a book in 1954 called Seduction and Innocence. And basically, once again, he targeted the comic book industry, and as a result, comic books, parents were raiding, at that time in the 50s, parents were raiding their children's rooms in search for those comic books, bringing them to local comic book burnings that were orchestrated by local leaders and communities at that time. In addition, because of the popularity of Seduction and Innocence at that time and what Wortham said, the Comic Code Authority was the CCA was established in the 1950s, and basically this became a censoring group that oversaw and developed stringent rules, specifically 41 provisions that they said comic book creators, publishers, and writers needed to follow for a comic book to be approved. In fact, if you look at a comic book, you'll see the CCA stamp of approval usually on the front page. And such things that the provisions stated in this, what's called, I call it the Post-Wertham era, is that there could be no using of the words or drawings of no using of the words horror, terror, or crime on the covers. You couldn't have any exaggerated drawings of any part of the female anatomy. You could never refer to drugs or show the bad guy hitting or in any way disrespecting a police officer. There could be no sex, no violence, no nudity, or no cursing. And this pretty much was as a result of Wertham's findings and claims in his text. Now, the reason why I feel that we need to bring up Wertham's findings and discuss it in detail is it's actually like a double-edged sword. Think about it. Not only am I citing the historical points relevant to the comic book industry, but if Wertham's claims are credible that comic books are not appropriate for children and are the underlying cause of asthma and children acting out, then it's reasonable to assert that they possess adult themes and content that are not for children. So there's a type of like double-edged claim there with using Wertham. On one hand, we're saying yes, Wertham may be completely full of it in targeting the comic book industry during this time of the Red Scare, but at the same time, there really is this other side of it where he says basically, yes, comics are not for children. Okay, so if that's the point, then he is saying, yes, I do support that comic books are adult themed and not appropriate. So in the post-Wertham era, specifically I'm talking the 1960s, you do see the transition of a lot of the comic book characters into campy and comedic ones. Obviously, I'm referring to the Dozer 1966 Batman television series where Batman and Robin became campy and comedic. But if we actually look at the 1960s, we can actually see a lot of adult themes relevant in comic books that connect to real-world issues. Specifically in the 1960s, Marvel, under people like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, released many characters that associated with real-life issues. Specifically, if we look at the debut of the X-Men in the 1960s, the X-Men deal with a race of people that are born with special powers known as mutants. And a lot of the themes and elements that we see in the X-Men comic books mirror what's taking place at that time with the civil rights movement, treating people fairly and equally. So, once again, if you're talking about themes and elements that are relevant in that comic book that appeal to adults, once again, it's another major supporter that comic books are not just for children. In fact, there's a major connection between a lot of teachers bring up, history teachers bring up about comparing the characters Professor Xavier and Magneto to civil rights leaders Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But even still, as we get into the 1970s, comic book characters continue to exhibit a lot of adult themes and issues that become very controversial. Let's look at just for a second and think about the 1970s. The 1970s was a period of radical change in the United States, and a lot of that change was echoed not just in comic books, which I'll get back to in a moment, but also think about it in terms of cinema and television. You had these sitcoms such as All in the Family, Good Times at Jefferson's, old Norman Lear properties that were talking about what was taking place in the world. And also, you started to have during the early 70s, a lot of very, very not mute, but dark stories that convinced people that a little girl was possessed because she spun her head and threw up pea soup. But at the same time, comic books were also undergoing this radical change in terms of looking more towards adult themes and messages in a way that they never did before. In fact, a lot of the superheroes during the time of the 70s were given what's been referred to as psychological analysis. Think about it. Specifically, this is evident in when Superman questions his role as Earth's savior. There was even a Batman comic book that had him dealing with a Nazi war criminal. At that time, I couldn't think of any more controversial in terms of comics than talking about something like a Nazi war criminal, specifically with like Night of the Reaper. Keeping in mind that the Holocaust took place 25, 30 years earlier. So this was still a very, very, very recent event that the comic books were focusing on. Once again, we even still have a lot of major characters during the 1970s that come to exist. This is when we get the debut of Ra's al Ghul, the Demon's Head, who has become one of the most notable and popular characters and villains in the Batman universe. But this movement of turning comic book characters, having them look towards more adult themes and messages, continues to exist throughout the 70s into the 80s. And this became clear in 1986 with Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, where Batman was an extremely dark and brooding older character. Even having, Batman dealing with, very controversial topics, even including fighting Superman. For Frank Miller, he wanted to base his look of Batman in Gotham City off where he lived at that time, which was New York City. New York City in the 1980s wasn't a great place to be. A lot of crime, it wasn't really a safe place to be. I'll put it this way. You wouldn't want to go to Times Square in the middle of the 1980s in the middle of the night. But Miller was doing this. We also see the debut of The Killing Joke in the late 80s. The Killing Joke is really a Joker story, more of a Joker story, because at the end of it, he really does have the last laugh. And it pretty much looks at one of the depictions, the various depictions of the Joker. However, probably one of the most adult themes and topics that has come out of a comic book, specifically in the 1980s, really had to do with what's referred to as the telephone stunt. If you remember to what I said earlier about finding all 4 issues of Death in the Family, this actually is a very controversial Batman story that is referred to as the telephone stunt by some. The storyline goes that Batman, it depicts a new Robin. Dick Grayson, the original first Robin, had moved on to become Nightwing. And we get this new Robin named Jason Todd. And Jason Todd is not like Dick Grayson. This is a type of Robin that talks back to Batman, has an edge. And what happens throughout the stories, there are 4 parts. He is in an explosion set by the Joker. So the cliffhanger is, did he live or did he die? So readers had a few days to call one of 2 numbers to vote if he lived or died. And that's why it was referred to by some as the telephone stunt. In the end of it, the readers actually decided, in a difference of 72 votes, there's around a little over 10,000 votes total, over 10,000. In a difference of 72 votes, the readers chose to kill off Jason Todd. So that's a very interesting thing. So once again, are comic books just for children? I believe that children are a major audience for the comic book industry, but I don't believe they're the primary only ones. I believe that comic books whatever type of comic book you're looking at, whether you're looking at DC Comics, Marvel Comics, Dark Horse Comics, independent comic books, even Ninja Turtle comic books, I believe they have always been a type of medium, even going back to the the late 1930s. I believe they have always been a type of medium that has been open not just to children, but to adults as well. I mean, there are comic books that exist that maybe some young children should not be reading based on the various themes, motifs, images that we see in them. But I can definitely say that yes, they're definitely meant for not just children. Which once again brings up a different issue. Is it appropriate for children to read all different types of comic books based on the content in it? You should consider a parent maybe should consider it just like the rating for a film. Would you want your child sitting through a PG movie or an R-rated movie? Would you want your child the same thing to look at R-rated material in a comic book? That's based on a case by case basis. So really, what I was really looking at tonight was, are comic books just for children? And the answer, I believe, is no. I would appreciate if people would leave any type of feedback that they care to regarding what we've discussed tonight. Please continue to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining, and we will be back again next week. Hope everybody is doing well, and have a good evening, everybody.